but that the two activities are quite closely related. And you're not thinking either when you remember or when you imagine. It's not the same thing.
Images come to your mind. You know?
Images come to your mind.
You remember, you say, well, last year I went to, Colorado mountains, all right? Let's remember. And surely images do come in your mind, so there's a connection between the two. The use of we have the students actually memorize poems. Of course, we don't have them memorize anything. I remember John Ruskin, one of the great reflective English writers, men of letters, said, you must be very careful what you introduce into the memory, because it's easier to get something in there than it is to get it out. There's some truth in that, you know. That is, he said, teachers, he said, ought to be very, very serious about whatever it is they ask their students to memorize, because it will have an effect on their whole lives. You know? That is, if you're running a restaurant, to use the image of food again, you want to be careful to know that you don't give anybody poison. It's one thing, again, in a literature class where you analyze literature, you know. Really, there's been a lot of dispute about that, you know, should there be some sort of censorship of the material? And however you feel about those arguments of censorship, I think most people would agree that analysis really doesn't do very much harm. In other words, you could take the worst piece of literature in the world, and as long as your attitude toward it is analytic, you got your rubber gloves on, don't you know? So you're coming at it in a safe way. You can take Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and go into a literature class and talk about the symbolism of the axe, don't you see? And you'll never go out and hack some poor old lady over the head. But you take that into your memory, and I don't know what might happen. See, I mean, the kind of teaching we do has about it an aspect of a certain danger here, and we therefore have always been super safe about the material we use. We have taken things like Mary Had a Little Lamb, and when they memorized that, we figured that's a good one. I mean, we don't have, when you say memorize, we understand what we want is
at all. Absolutely not that at all. And besides, we make a distinction between what would be called artificial memory and natural memory. That is, this is a common distinction. Everyone has always made this distinction. Natural memory is everyone has natural memory. That is, everyone simply remembers things. All the words that we know, nearly all of the words that we know in our vocabulary are in our memory. All the faces that we have, that is, when you recognize people by their face or by the sound of their voice, it's because you remember them. It's in your memory. But you never tried to remember their face, probably, or their name, or anything of the sort. It's just that you met them a few times, and you saw them a few times, and the next time you saw them, you recognized them. It got into your memory.
There are sophists who sell gimmicks for doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, then there's the guy who says, you know, I'll give you a 10-day course, and you'll...
How to remember every face you ever
remember every... It's not only artificial, but it's phony.
You remember the face, but you remember the person. You know,
yeah, it's a trick.
So we don't do that at all. That kind of memorization we don't do.
No, we don't do any of that. In fact, students learn the poems by listening to them rather than by reading them. It's not only more effective, that is, you learn much better that way, but it's more appropriate for poetry. Poetry is meant to be heard. And nearly everybody admits that. Poetry is meant to be heard. It's meant to be recited. And it's like learning a song. Most people don't learn a song by reading the music. They hear the tune and it just gets into their memory, that's all, and they go around humming it after that. And they learn the words in the same way. What we do is have a student who already knows the poem go into a small class and simply say, repeat after me.
And we have an upper class student teach the freshmen, that is the juniors, who already has been through the program. come back and teach the freshmen.
And you'll say, my love is like a red, red rose that's lately sprung in June. Repeat after me. And the whole class will repeat. And they'll go through the whole poem, and in about 30 minutes they can learn one lyric of about that length of the poem that I just started reciting. There's no strain about it. Usually I always resented memorization in school very much, and I never was any good at it. I never learned anything that I had to sit down and memorize. I was a piece of paper. Yeah. I used to memorize my own speeches in high school, and I could never remember them. I'd always forget them right in the middle, usually, and then the day after I gave them, I couldn't remember them at all. But natural memory doesn't work that way. It turns out you can't forget things that are in your memory naturally.
Yeah, they call it learning by heart. It's a very good phrase, learning by heart. What is the heart? I mean, what do you mean by that? Mind and heart, everybody...
You learn something that you want to have in your heart. It's something you take into your heart. That's why it's so important to be careful about what you do take into your heart or put into the memories of children.
The reason why it's dangerous, you see, is that the heart is really taken to be the seat of the will. That is, the philosophers who study the poets will say, well, you know what the poets really mean by that, see? They begin to try to explain what the poets mean, and they never get all of it, but they get some of it. And the sum that they certainly have is that is the difference when people say the mind and the heart. By the mind, they mean the pure knowledge, but by the heart, they mean putting that knowledge into action in the will, see? And when we say that we learn something by heart, what we're really doing is taking into ourselves material upon which we will act. In other words, it's formative. Your character is being formed by the things you memorize. Not just your intellect, but your character. And one has to stop and say, well, now we've got to be very broad about this kind of thing. There is a body of traditional poetry that has always been memorized, year after year and generation after generation. And it has turned out to be the stuff out of which our tradition has come. It's been tried, in other words. And good people have come out of that. We know its results. And so we'll stick to that. My love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Let's just try that. See? Now some people say, but that's so old-fashioned. And we say, well, don't worry about it being old-fashioned. See?
It turns out that if you want to reflect on any of the subjects we're talking about, that you need to have something in your memory to reflect on.
See, the philosopher can't operate. The intellect can't operate unless it has something in the memory to work on.
At the beginning of Plato's dialogue, The Republic, that famous dialogue, there's a little kind of introduction to that where Socrates and the young men who are asking him about the nature of justice talk to an old man named Cephalus. Most people just kind of ignore this. They kind of breeze through this because they say, well, let's get on with the real argument. Let's get down to the thing. And they don't notice. But they say to Cephalus, Cephalus, maybe you can tell these young men what justice is. And he says, well, I don't really know. He's a very old man. And he says, I don't really want to engage in this conversation. I've got more important things to do. He's going to go out and offer an offering to the gods, as a matter of fact. But he says, from what I've heard, the poet said, and then he quotes a poem. And the poem says something like, you ought to pay your debts if you're going to be just. That's kind of what the poem amounts to. And then he leaves. It turns out that he was right. That's the answer. That is what justice is. But they go on. Nobody pays any attention to what he said, and they go on with their long, long, long dialogue. But what you'd say is that Cephalus has reflected on that subject, and in his memory, you see, is that poem that he can call up. And he knows that the answer is there, not in philosophical terms, of course, in poetic terms, but it's there. And as an old man, he can rely on that.
I'd like to know if we wouldn't live in an era where any new program, so long as it's unique, and I put that in quotation marks, anything to be tried, would you have received sponsorship from the institution? In other words, do you think the program is something that exists because there's a realization that there's a need to return that kind?
No, our program does not exist for that reason at all. To the extent that it is recognized as being that kind of a program, the university would like to get rid of it. As you probably know, we've experienced a great deal of difficulty with the university. We came into existence more or less by accident. About 8-9 years ago, the University of Kansas received a grant from the Carnegie Corporation to start colleges within the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, experimental colleges. And I agreed to be the director of one of these colleges, and I was chosen entirely by accident. That is, the dean was away, and a sub-dean chose me. The dean would have never chosen me because he knows I'm a troublemaker. And I like, not the present dean, another dean. But I said, yeah, I'll agree to be an administrator, that is to run this college, this sub-college, as long as I can continue to teach full-time. That was the first condition. And secondly, as long as I can start some kind of new program in it. And he said, okay, that's fine, that's what we really want. Well, we devised this program, Mr. Senior and I and another colleague, pretty much along these lines. And we went around to everybody in the university and we told them what we were going to do. And they said, oh, that's all right. That's sure, that's okay. Everybody's experimenting now. And as an experiment, we called it an experiment in tradition. That was the name of the program.
They heard the experiment part, but they didn't listen to the tradition.
They thought, oh, well, they didn't take that very seriously. And one thing we found out was that, of course, they all said we'd fail. They said, sure, you can do this because we know you'll fail. Nobody is interested in reading Homer and talking about poetry and all that stuff. You remember, this was when they were burning down the student union and the students were only interested in politics. They said, oh, well, look, this is ridiculous. But since it can't do any harm, that is, since it won't succeed, it's perfectly all right.
So some of our friends even suggested that we don't call it, something like, an integrated humanities program, but rather call it something, like disintegrated structure of revolution or something like that, because that would pack him in, or if you're going to teach Homer, you say the sex life of Helen of Troy. I mean, that'll pack him in, But we didn't do any of that. We just talked to our students the way we've been talking to you.
And it turned out that it was just
tremendous response.
Oh, it was the response.
We had
students
300 students the second year, just like that.
Yeah.
We started with a small experimental group of 20, and we never advertised or anything. Really, it just went like wildfire. There were large numbers of students who really were thirsty, I think is the word for this. Hungry, or to use our image of the meal. They really wanted to sit down at a banquet like this and think about these things and read these books. And it surprised us. It surprised everyone.
Well, it surprised everyone, and you have to realize, again, in the practical order, that when you succeed in an experiment, it has certain implications for those people who are not engaged in the experiment. That is, it suggests that maybe they ought to change in some way. And it also, of course, has another practical effect. That is that if you begin to get large numbers of students in a brand new experimental program, those students do not take courses in other departments that they might normally take. If the enrollment in your Latin program, and this was a new Latin program, which was connected with the humanities program, it's an oral Latin program, very different from the standard program.
Analytic approach.
From the analytical, scientific approach to Latin. If you quadruple the enrollment in Latin overnight, in 1 year, then the French department begins to say, we're short one section of French. Where do you suppose that section went? And they say, well, the only language that had an increase in enrollment this year was Latin. And they say, that's where it went. All right, that's where it went. And the German department says the same thing, and the English department, well, they used to give, credit for English for this program. There were 2 full professors of English teaching in the program, and we had designed it in such a way as to cover the material. Well, suddenly, there were 15 fewer sections of freshman English. And you have to understand that in any institution, that's bound to have serious kind of political ramifications.
Well, it has budgetary ramifications.
Bad budgetary ramifications, which are much more serious than political ramifications. That is, if the number of sections you have go down, you get less money, and you can't hire graduate students to teach those sections. And so, as soon as we succeeded, people weren't nearly so friendly about the program.
That certainly did cause a lot of trouble, just the sheer success, which I'll say surprised everyone, including ourselves. We never intended this thing really when we started to be quite so boisterous and exciting as it was, really.
No, we kind of got carried away. It kind of carried us away.
But it was certainly a marvelous thing to see. So many students, we've noticed this year, perhaps for the first time, perhaps last year, it started last year, a change that is coming over the students, however. That is, the generation of the radicals, in a way, you see, found us an alternative. That generation was, for better or worse, and it was mostly for worse, interested in ideas. That is, they were seeking some kind of truth. They went to the damnedest places to find it, just outrageous experiments and so on, as you know. But there was some sort of an urge to find out what life was all about in some way, And I think a generation like that is profoundly teachable. So I really do. They are seeking. What we're running into now, and some of you here may be in this generation, and you can think about this now, because it does sound like a pretty strong rebuke to you. We find with the freshmen now coming up for the first time this year that they seem to have turned off. That is, their idea is, I don't want to know. All I want to do is find a safe job somewhere. That is, we find this generation of students interested not at all in a university education. We wonder why they come to the university. They do better in a trade school. That is, what they're seeking is just simply some kind of marketable skill. And they want to get in and out as fast as possible, and they don't want to learn anything.
Well, and I must say,
and they're very hard to teach. But we found exceptions.
Well, and two, you have to add to that, as long as we're saying something that some students or young people might take as a rebuke, we might as well go ahead and go the whole hog and say something that might offend some parents. It might as well offend everyone, as long as we're doing it. It might offend some parents who are here, and that is, we find that these students have these attitudes toward education very often because their parents are driving them into a marketable skill. That is, they're saying, well, I don't care what you do, but you go into the school of business. You can do anything you want to, but you go into the school of business, because you'll get something, you'll come out of there with something that you can put on the market.
A tremendous change about this. People are running scared. There is a psychology and about not success even anymore. That is, you don't find the guy who wants to go out and make $1 million. We're talking about people who want to play it safe. That is it isn't the drive. It isn't the old economic drive. It's kind of a collectivist mentality, really. That is that it's going to be very difficult to get through life, and what you've got to do is find some place where no harm will come to you. You've got to find some job where there'll be lots of security and so on. And as I say, if a person really holds that view, well, let's think about it just a minute. I know it's getting late in the afternoon, but just reflect on that. Why would anybody ever feel that way? Don't you think, and I'm putting it in the form of a question, not an answer, because we've been talking about it, we're not sure. But don't you think that this comes out of a sort of skepticism? That is, a despair about ideas. See, that is, there isn't any truth. There isn't any beauty, there isn't any good. I mean, look at that last generation. Look at them. They saw it all over the world, and they all ended up on drugs, and they ended up in hospitals. They ended up miserable. They ended up, wrecks, moral, physical, mental wrecks. What good did their search do them, You can see the younger brothers and sisters coming along and looking at them, you know, and saying, I'm not going to end up like that, see. It's sort of cynicism, really, I think. And then they turn around and say, well, what am I going to do? And the answer is, well, I'm going to have a nice, fast car. Or I'm going to be able to drive down the road at 100 miles an hour anytime I want. At least I can have that, see. The hell with truth and beauty and good and all those things and seeking, you know, the way out of all this. I'm just going to get what I know I can get. So they lower their sights and they get a kind of a glint in their eye, and it's a sharp, sort of greedy little glint, you know, and they say, that's what I'm going to go after. And one would say, oh, gee, you know, your older brother was a slob, I knew him well, I taught him, he was a wreck, he was a mess, and he failed. But by golly, you know, his sights were higher than yours. I mean, I would say you're wrong about that. Whatever you do, don't become a cynic, you know. Americans are getting this way. We think we've lost. I think it may be a consequence of the Vietnamese War, partly. That is a great feeling that America is not promises anymore. You remember Carl Sandburg's poem, is it Sandburg or who wrote that? America is promises. I forget, maybe it was McLeish or someone else, but there was a famous poem written about 50 years ago about America. And you got Kennedy and the Camelot stuff. Now that all turned out to be fake, you see. A lot of that was fake. But are you really willing to say that life is hopeless? You know, are you really willing to say that America is lost? See,
and that therefore all we can do, you see, is retreat into some nice, safe little way of life for ourselves?
I would use Mr. Quinn's example when we were talking about the purposes. That is, if you work for an immediate purpose only, and you leave out the other two, it turns out you ruin the immediate one. I would say the guy that plays it safe is going to end in jail. That's the safest place there is, you know.
Or
you lower your sights, you know.
Or an insane asylum.
Yeah, you lower your sights like that. Somebody else with imagination and ideas and will and love, someone else, you know, is going to run your life for you. So don't be, whatever you do, don't be cynic. But we are getting late. But
I ask this question because sometimes I'm interested of it. I live in a contemplative monastery in Greece, and we were just looking at people who might say this program is not advantageous because they become cynical or jaded in their view of the master. How many people get accused of elitism?
Of elitism?
Elitism. Where people that?
Yeah.
They can't be contemplative because it's the prerogative of the rich.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, that's a searching question, because I suppose we have to ask what lies behind the idea. I think a question like that presupposes a misunderstanding of what you do when you have regard for things.
We have been accused of that, by the way.
Yeah, we were accused of that.
That's one of those questions very, very often raised. It turns out that our students are very close to one another, for example, and they tend to have a certain mark on them. This contemplative mark.
They sometimes seem to be. I mean, from the outside, I don't blame people sometimes. You know, they look and they see these students of ours, and our students are marked by a certain kind of cliquishness. That is, they do like each other, and they do withdraw in many ways from activity. And a lot of people say, well, these guys are snobs. You know, they think they're better than everybody else, and sometimes they do think they're better than everybody else, for that matter. I mean, you know, they're not perfect. See? And sometimes it goes to their heads. I mean, there's a stage when they think, boy, this is really wonderful.
I've read Plato,
you know, and they go around lording it over. That's the sophomores do that. That's known as sophomoric behavior. And sometimes the freshmen are scared by it, but the sophomores do tend to be. So, I mean, but you're talking about something far beyond that, I think. The charge of elitism would come from the idea that the contemplative is selfish. See, that is, that he's getting something out of it for himself, and he's got it, and that would be a very, very wicked thing. That would. There are people like that. There are people who misunderstand the contemplative, and they become aesthetes. That is, they have great regard for nature, but it's a selfish regard. You know, it's my experience to see those things. And I think that is a kind of a twisting or a kind of perversion of the genuinely contemplative life, because the contemplative must see that when he sits before, let's say, the creatures of the world, see, like water or like birds, he must see that he himself is a creature too. See, I mean, if he really finds out who he is, well, Mr. Quinn was quoting the great Greek oracle, "Who are you?" And there's somebody up there who says, "Who are you?" "You're nothing," he says to you. "You're nothing." You know, that is really a kind of humility will grow out of this. You begin to see that you are part of something so much greater than yourself. That what grows out of it, far from a selfish elitism, is a sort of poverty. And as a matter of fact, the other charge, we've had people accuse us of elitism one minute, and then when they find out, when they get beyond the sophomores to the juniors, as it were, and they find out what the results of this, then they say, well, you people will end up dead broke if you do that. You see, you'll end up poor. And our answer to that is, well, now again, there's a mean between riches and there's a mean between riches and destitution. See, nobody's arguing for starvation, but poverty. Well, some students have.
Yes, some students have.
Some students actually have, and have actually become members of contemplative orders and things like that. Although very few. That's not perhaps.
I think a lot of our students, for example, have become lawyers. But I don't think any of our students that we would call our students, that is, students who really have seen these things and assent to them, that they've become lawyers, but they haven't gone down to Houston to work for some gigantic corporation. They're working, and they've decided they're going to become small-town lawyers, and they're not going to get rich.
Right? There's a relation between the word humility and the word human. And, of course, whenever anybody talks about humility, which is the opposite of elitism, see, whenever anybody talks about, I remember a story they told of T.S. Eliot, the poet. He was at a cocktail party one night, and someone was saying, "Oh, Mr. Eliot, you're so wonderful, and I'm so nothing." And after he walked away, Mr. Eliot said, "Who does he think he is to be so humble?" He said, it becomes a kind of perverse arrogance, and so you always get a little nervous when you talk about this. I mean, I don't like to say that we really do believe in being humble. Look at us, we're not humble at all. Here we are, being teachers and so on, telling everybody else all kinds of things. But still, I think we would say, whether we are or not, we certainly would hold that insofar as you seriously study the poets, you cannot be elite. There's no way you can be elite. It destroys the basis of elitism, which is selfishness.
And arrogance.
And arrogance. I'm in it for what I can get out of it. If you, the contemplative says that's precisely what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to come here and get what I can take. I'm rather going to sit here and listen, which in a way is to give myself to see whatever it is that I study, so that it turns out to destroy it. And then I would say, just as a third thing, we have studiously, really studiously, zealously tried for all students. That is, we do not limit this program to honor students or to spot students or anything like that. We have all kinds of people. We take everybody, even the most hopeless students. We take pre-med students who are really hopeless. We take engineers, We take and even beyond that, English majors. They're the worst ones of all.
We've got some qualitative engineers coming out of this program. You watch out for them.
Some of the best students we've had.
Yeah, they've been some of the best students.
So we certainly are aware of it. There is a perversion, I think, of this life, which is sometimes Voltaire, for example, who wrote about the cultivate your garden and sit in your own private place. He was really asking for a kind of elitism. He was saying that we should withdraw from the vulgar, and just be aesthetes. But that's a misunderstanding.
The other kind of elitism is that they accuse of us. They say, well, you guys think you've got hold of the truth, the truth. They always say it that way, that you've got hold of the truth and that it's your truth, and you have it. And again, it's to misunderstand. It's a basic misunderstanding allied to the other one. That is, it isn't our truth or your truth or anybody else's truth. And whoever said that we had it or that we really have hold of it. We don't make any such claim. To the contrary, the farther you go, the more you get to the position of Socrates. That is, that you really don't know very much at all.
It has a hold on you.
It gets you rather
It has
than
a
you
hold
getting
on
it.
you, and it's the hold of its attractive power. It's the hold of love, which is kind of ignorance. When you love somebody, you don't know anything about them. You've lost all knowledge. Nobody would ever get married except for that. It's the cleverest trick that Cupid put over on man.
Better let these people go, yeah.
So you want to continue this conversation?
We'll stick around for a while.